Thank you, Eleanor. There are a lot of food for thought there. And as a curator myself now, I think I share a lot of feelings, what you just expressed. I mean, I think I'm so pleased that Korea or Korean art now has become a very important part in our kind of conceptualizing Asian art, because that is very much lacking kind of, so I'm very glad you tackled the question of hierarchy in collecting or displaying Asian art. I know now we have actually half an hour for discussions or questions and answers. And so we have some questions coming. Might just put them to you, or maybe you can read. I think maybe let's do it by the order of the presentation. So the first question is to Stanley. It's actually from Chelsea Foxwell. I think you can read it, and the question is really about the taxonomic determination of Chinese objects as sculpture. Basically, you put the quotes at the very beginning of your presentation, and now the question is whether we should still use the terminology sculpture to define non-European, or even I think even the European Roman antiquity, and how do we put them into a contemporary or modern context? So do you have any thought on that, Stanley?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much to Chelsea for her question. It goes to the heart of many issues here. I think one of the things in my journey through years of research and thinking about this subject is that I began with a rather black and white kind of understanding. The West, in a sense, had art history and had sculpture as these terms. And in China, these terms did not exist until the modern period, until they were translated into Chinese. That's another issue. But this kind of imbalance, I think, is at the heart of what I was thinking about and many of our concerns. What I've discovered, I think, in researching this further is that sculpture itself is a very much constructed historical concept in Europe and in the West. Hence my ending with the view of an exhibition of medieval sculpture, in which Christian works that were once in churches and religious sanctuaries were now taken, removed, and put up on pedestals and arranged by chronological order or other kinds of, or maybe religious reasons. I hope this anyway is getting towards answering your question, which is that it's an issue. The quotations don't need to only go around Chinese sculpture or some other non-Western type of sculpture, but around sculpture itself. That our field, art history, that informs how we organize our knowledge is an issue. And I think that it's not so much a matter of replacing the term. I feel right now, at least, that the term is important, it's powerful, it's not going away. If you or I decide not to use it, it's better, it's more important to engage the term. That is, rather than scare quotes around sculpture, I've been, in my paper and my publications now, I put a capital S. It's sculpture with a capital S. And I think that is a subject that can be interrogated, questioned, looked at in comparative perspective, and in other ways across the Western-Eastern divide and across in a global sense. So, thank you for your question.
Thank you, Stanley. And now we have actually two questions coming for, oh no, one question for Jason. It's really about the 1935 Burlington exhibition. The question is the first scenario where the drawing of painting the calligraphy was exhibited there. I mean, it's of course, it's a factual question. we know they are there, but maybe what kind of a reception from the Western viewers to that part of the exhibition? I think it's very much, I've read some reviews before, but maybe you have more information and more reflection on that. Jason.
Yes. Thank you so much. The 1935-36 show has literally hundreds of comments in the Burlington Magazine and other contemporary journals publishing during the run of the show. And what is interesting, specifically for paintings, is Arthur Waley's attack on how boring and this show is in terms of how they hung the works. It's nothing like the Persia show from a couple of years ago, the Great Persia show, which really academically changed the nature of Persian art in the West. And he was quite disappointed in the painting section. And there's a lot of back and forth between him and Percival David and the organizers. No comment was ever unanswered by the organizers within print during the run of the show. In terms of exhibitions of Chinese paintings, you can find them in the expos of the 19th and early 20th century, but also looking at the Freer show in Chicago, Cologne in 26, Berlin in 29, and Amsterdam in 25, all had paintings. And interesting enough is the Cologne work that's on display at the Art Institute is a Chinese temple wall painting that was displayed by Yamanaka and then acquired by the Art Institute. But like Fletcher noted with rubbings, the Chinese temple wall paintings from the 12th to 13th, 14th century are often retouched by the time they reached American museums for acquisition. So I would say there is plenty of paintings, plenty of discourse about how they're hung, but also provenance and how their works changed for display in a gallery versus display at a museum have happened over the years.
Thank you, Jason. I believe this afternoon's panel would probably focus on more this exhibiting of Chinese paintings. So I think we probably can hear more on that this afternoon. And then now two questions for Fletcher. And one is about the collecting of ink rubbings. Is some impact on Warner's interests from Japan? That's the first question. And the second is a bit more technical. It's about what kind of retouching you find on the rubbing or you show on the slides. And also, I think you already mentioned, but it's a question again, is curator, scholars interest in rubbing, and then they are part of the history. What's your your idea of conservation? Because you're also interested in conservation, would you remove those retouching, and how do you really reflect the original rubbing? I mean, that's basically the questions about.
All right. Well, thank you for these wonderful questions. And let me thank also all of our panelists and organizers. It's wonderful to see this project get off the ground and bring this group of scholars together. And so I'll actually answer the second question first. In my own view and my interest in art historiography is that one of the really wonderful aspects of researching these objects is that those types of approaches to the material, as a result of their continued survival and presence on the object, allow the object to encapsulate and crystallize a particular moment in time and history of the discipline. And so I have a strong interest in the history of conservation science as well. And for those of you familiar with some of my other work done on the imperial processions and their restorations, I find it very interesting the way in which sometimes very radical approaches to these materials were undertaken on objects. And while it's unfortunate in hindsight, the degree to which non-recoverable intervention occurred on these objects, to understand that history of restoration and subsequent conservation can tell us an awful lot about the theoretical underpinnings and pedagogical approaches of museums and curators and scholars during this formative period for what I call the professionalization of the discipline. Because I'm really working on, a generation to 2 generations after really the interest in East Asian art takes off in the US and Europe, but looking specifically now at the figures who are training students and becoming institutionalized in these new professional capacities. So I would say, from my own perspective, what we need to do is highlight and understand this history, but not necessarily intervene and remove it. And then also just in terms of materials, it seems that in some cases, the retouching was done both in China after the original rubbings were taken, which was a fairly common practice. And then in other cases done once the objects arrived to the US. It seems as though the ink used was fairly accurate pine charcoal ink, but undertaken more extensively on some objects than others, which I've argued in most cases was because it was the intent of the curator to put these objects on display, and they felt that they weren't adequately, I'll use scare quotes here, complete in order to display them. So different types of interventions were undertaken using different materials. And I'll just encourage everyone again also to take a look at some of the conservation materials uploaded recently online by the Cleveland Museum of Art, detailing their conservation of the 2 imperial processions in their collection, which were created by Yamanaka and Company in the early 20th century, which reveals a lot about this process, which was also a bit more radically undertaken there. Now to quickly also answer Adriana's question as well, this is a great point and something that I didn't have a lot of time to get into in my presentation today, but the way in which Warner is not operating on his own, and he has a tremendous circle of influence that's impacting his thinking on these materials, especially scholars and dealers from Japan. So as I mentioned, and has been mentioned by other panelists, much of the collecting occurring and much of Warner's theoretical underpinnings are also coming out of an imperialist and colonialist background as well, particularly from his connections in Japan. And I'll say in the case of Warner, what maybe makes him a little bit unique in his approaches to these materials, even as he draws on Japanese scholars' interests in rubbings, is that really he's not trained rigorously as a philologist. So his linguistical capabilities are relatively limited, which causes him to turn towards other individuals like artisans. He rooms with a couple of very important sculptors and lacquer experts on his first trip to Japan, and is heavily impacted by this sort of simultaneous development, again, as Eleanor noted, of the problematic terminology of folk art discourse in the early 20th century, individuals like Yanagi Muniyoshi. So he approaches these objects really as aesthetic objects in a way that other sinologists are not treating them so directly. And it's my feeling that that's part of the reason he has such a heavy interest in exhibiting these materials and utilizing them with his students during this period.
Thank you. Thank you, Fletcher. Okay, for Eleanor, actually, there are quite a few questions for you. And I don't think you want to answer them separately because many of them touch the very common kind of concern or discussion. One is, I think you raised a very important thing is the classification system in the West, whether it really affect collecting Asian art or East Asian art. Second is what do you see the others when kind of Asian art or Korean art being viewed as the other in the West? Would they be viewed in a similar way as the other when they back to their home origin, like back to Korea? And that's quite a kind of interesting question too. And I think the last question for Eleanor is also because you experience as a curator at BM and MED, and what do you think the biggest difference in the representation of Korean art in the UK and in the United States? I think maybe one of the questions I may have I missed also talking about. No, I think yeah, that's maybe it's basically it's the core of these questions.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think that's what I was trying to also show in the talk is that I'm just grappling with all of this. Some days like hourly, other days, not as often. And I think in that sense, what Professor Stanley Abe was talking about, like pre-existing terminology and how do we do that, and how do you still recognize a history and what a terminology may represent, but it also, as also I think Fletcher, you were saying, you can't just like throw things away without actually engaging with them as well. So I I think it's like a cop out to say, but I don't actually know of a better way to think about this at the moment, is some of it's case by case and then seeing how that develops into to larger subsets or subgroups. But at the same time, I think the questions about value, there was one that had popped up, and you can see very specific cases, say like Koryo Buddhist paintings, how their value in some ways change, whether it's monetary. I don't ever think that they change in the sense that they are valuable objects or they're thought of as sacred or beautiful objects, but their attributions, go from being Korean to Chinese to Japanese back to Korean, and that inherently will change the way, and that's over time, in different regions. And then, so you have to look at that, very specifically, I think. The other things about, I think that the one question about, the othering and, where do we continue to, and I also think like othering happens obviously in various ways. It can be very big, broad as East-West, huge misconceptions, like the example that I had posed, but there's constantly othering that's happening even in our own subfields, right? We have different kinds of canons, we have different kinds of straw men that exist in each of our subfields, in each of our regions, in each of our even media. And I think you have to still be conscious of all that. That then gets also when you get into a bigger Western or outside of those places, mapped onto other kinds of hierarchies. So I think it really is, it's exhausting because when you try to think of all those things, it's very, very hard. But at the same time, not thinking about those things is equally as problematic. And yeah, and then I also feel like in the sense of exhibiting art, we didn't really actually talk about audience engagement. That's the other side of exhibitions. How much do I expect an audience to get from an exhibition that I do? Or if they're only in the gallery for 2 to 3 minutes, what am I expecting for them to see or understand, versus writing a volume text or a dissertation or a research project? Like those are all things that we have to, or even exhibition catalog, that lives beyond, say, a specific exhibition. So, and I think that was all really touched upon in everybody's presentations, right? The text that survives, the images that survive, the studies that occur. I'm not answering this question very well. I just think it's just that you have to constantly be willing to recognize that there's a spectrum and like where you're falling in that spectrum for that specific thing that you're looking at. Well, that's where I'll stop.
Right, thank you, Eleanor. I think I may missed one question. It's also come from Chelsea about, you particularly mentioned about this hierarchy or no hierarchy. Could be a misconception or in some intended kind of manipulation of this Western idea by some of the creators of contemporary art. And of course, I think here this panel looks at the history of exhibitions and or exhibiting Asian art. But I think many misconceptions or problems arise from all contemporary use of this word, so this vocabulary. So do you have any thought on that?
Yeah, I definitely think the contemporary, whether it's playing with or playing against, can highlight some things, or, and this is, now I'm going to sound like a old person, but the tidbits of information that people get from social media and how that then becomes, the groundwork for how people interpret XYZ thing, whether it's an Instagram post or Twitter or TikTok. And so, the contemporary and how it's going to intervene in the way museums in particular are reaching different kinds of publics, or all of that is something we have to think about. And then I think in the sense that the contemporary artist or the contemporary individual who actually is very, very keen on understanding what these hierarchies are and then working against them, but if it gets occluded in his intervention in actually flattening everything out, I think that is, the problem in some ways Chelsea is trying to raise. And so God, it's really hard. And yeah, and I understand you're like laughing, but
It's hard. You're right. It's absolutely hard.
it's hard in the sense that you need these moments for people to be interjecting, but then again, not allowing that thing to become the next flattened harky standard, right? So it's the constant placing that stake in the ground and then being willing to either put another stake next to it or push that stake down and putting it again. But I think it is just about the reevaluation and then where you let different kinds of voices. And I actually ran out of time, but I think it really is about the multiplicities of standards, values, centers. So therefore, actually no centers, but it is about the multiplicities of voices, forms, and individuals that can obviously help create these different places.
Thank you. Alan, I think it's actually, you've touched a very important question, which I think maybe we need all the panelists to give more thoughts, which is like the interaction between East Asian countries and Western context, because very much kind of we see how East Asian art being presented in Western museums, but have we ever discussed interaction from the original countries? Maybe because the reception of Japanese art and Chinese art is quite, not completely different, but they're very different, because if you look at the expos, I mean, I understand kind of the Chinese government, either now or 50 years ago, the intention to create their own image, their own art in the West. And of course, now we have a much complex interaction, because we have a lot of, like Chelsea mentioned, this contemporary artists, they also become part of this interaction. So I think when we look at the Western context, we need to also look at the other side. I mean, it's also what the people really want to create, this image in the original countries, like what Chinese art would be sending out by the Chinese governments or exhibition organizers, curators. I mean, that's so I think that's a question we can think about too.
Could I ask a question of Jason? This has been something that's been on my mind as well.
Yes.
You mentioned Otto Bouchard, who I have written about recently also, and his export of goods from the Binyang Central Cave. And there are a lot of complex issues that we've been talking about, and something which has come up recently in some discussions that I've been part of concerning restitution, in particular to dealers whose objects were seized in the mid-20th century, particularly by the American government, or dispersed by the Nazi government as well. And so Bouchard is someone who, as a Jewish German, the sale of his works in the mid-1930s is largely coming about as a result of pressure from the German government. And he later on has a piece seized also by the US government, but he's restituted following the war. Whereas the Yamanakas, whose contents of their galleries are seized, and they were not restituted by the US government. And so I've felt that it's very difficult to parse out the sort of layers that occur with objects over the course of the 20th century, because in many cases, these objects were looted from their original sites. Right. To what degree do we owe then restitution to the dealers who removed the objects?
I think I'll complicate your question more, is that the sale of in the United States of the Yamanaka collection was quote unquote curated by Salmony. So you have Salmony work with Lou in the 30s and in Germany in the 20s, comes to America, reestablishes work with dealers, and then seizes the Japanese dealers' collection of Chinese art in America. So I think it's an issue of just finding the parts and laying them out first in factual order, very much a chronological approach, but then start parsing out the reasons behind each. And then I think we can at least have the discussion of facts. It's very difficult to see the works that are in the sale that Bouchard allowed, and then the works that weren't allowed, and you can see them in museums today. And so there is this complication, but there is this, I'm glad we're talking about it because that helps show that finding what is from the dealers that is taken, plus looking at the life of Duanfang's work that people are celebrating. We have part of his collection. You have this dichotomy of provenance to prove a point that it's okay to have it. But then there's a provenance of, well, yeah, I can prove that you have a complication of having it. And as a museum director now, it's like, yes, there's a lot to unpack. And it's best to get it out in the open is my view. And it's a lot of time in archives, as I appreciate everyone's doing now. So I didn't answer the question, I just made it harder. So I do that often.
No, it's very complex issues and I appreciate that. And I certainly don't have answers myself.
Right. I think there are a few more questions just came in, and for Jason, and also for Fletcher. So if you can, I mean, it's the first question. Maybe it's not easy to give a full answer here. Was there any record of Chinese paintings being first exhibited? Could you say something like whether they affect the public opinion? I think that's a quite big question here.
No, I think the biggest one for public opinion would be 35, 36 as I've come across, but I know there's paintings before that in the earlier exhibits in 25, 26, 29, and even the U Morphopolis collection that's published as early as I think 27 with paintings. So it's a matter of parsing out expos and looking at what happened in the late 19th and early 20th century. But I think it's there, but it might have to be unpacked by an etching of an artist's interpretation of an exhibit, but you might see a painting in the background. As Dr. Abe showed, there's a picture of Guy on the street with fellow people from China next to him. So I would say it's a hard one, but I think it's there, but I'm unable to go very much deeper than that.
And Jason, it's also a question from Wei Chen. I think it's actually also something we touched on. Is that the notion of Chinese art kind of created in the West, whether it's something to do with how China itself was changing during the early 20th century, because China was turning into a national state. So whether it's something related to that.
I would say my touchstone would be Duanfang, to look at what he's doing abroad and traveling. And on the way back from Europe, for example, he stops in Egypt and makes rubbings of Egyptian sarcophagus and takes those back. So you can see collections like that. If you look at Duanfang plus Egypt online on Google, you'll see now archives are publishing his rubbings of him collecting rubbings of from Egypt on the way back. But then thinking about China is China, looking at the 35 exhibition and the Executive Yuan supporting the excavations at Yunshu and publishing that and getting that into the 4-volume books and noting that in the publications, in their own publications, but also the London exhibit, China is supporting scientific work that you'll see Japan's doing in Manchukuo or in Korea. And so that nationalized scientific demarcation of knowledge and information writing and history and self-identification as either as a nation or Japan as a nation state taking over Korea and Northeast China, you'll see that they use science and publication and exhibit and collecting to define themselves. And China was well on its way to doing that. But then with 1911, there was a lot more. China complicated itself, but it's still defining China, if that makes sense. That art helps define the nation. And I think we can pop through time, as Professor Wu Hong noted at the beginning, how 1980 looked with the Bronze Age show, 1972 with the great archaeological exhibit defined China as the PRC versus, we can go on and on. But I think that's enough for me. I don't want to take up any more time.
Right, thank you. For Fletcher, there's one more question. Maybe I think it's at the very end. It's because I tell you a story. When the Art Institute, when they had opportunity to collect rubbings, they said no, because at that time the committee did not consider ink rubbing as art. And so it's very interesting now because now photography, if you think of the contrast between rubbing and the photography, now photography is so prominently as part of fine art or art now, but rubbing hasn't been really treated as an art form. So what's your, the question is basically ask you further elaborate on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting question. And I'll say, you know, as I mentioned at the end of my presentation, the idea of not treating Chinese ink rubbings as aesthetic objects, I would consider to be something that originates in the latter half of the 20th century, particularly in the US, because these collections really were prized and built over the first 5 decades of the 20th century. And so I'll say in terms of the question and why Warner seemed to have a facility, say, for example, for making his own rubbings, let me first say the results of the rubbings that he took are not great. They're rather odd in some cases and not particularly well executed. But that being said, I think he was interested in these hands-on approaches to objects, again, because of his background with studio art practice. He himself was an amateur sculptor over the course of his lifetime and very much involved with artisans, particularly from Japan. Those 2 artisans I mentioned, Rokaku Shisui and Niro Chunosuke, are very important lacquer specialists and restorers of Buddhist sculpture, respectively. And so he, from his very moment of beginning to learn about East Asian art history, is directly involved with artisan practice. And so I think this really informs his desire to have a hands-on approach with materials with his early cohorts of students, as well as when he was out in the field also. And it's also my hope, I'll just say again, I'm very excited about the Cleveland rotation, and I think rubbings are about due for a comeback in terms of exhibitions.
Yeah, thank you. I know our time is up because there's going to be an afternoon panel starting very soon, 12:30. So we want to leave some time for people for lunch. Just before we getting off, I also want to like to invite people. I mean, unfortunately, we're still doing virtual. But if you, by chance in Chicago, do come to Art Institute, because we just recently reinstalled our Buddhist art gallery. We bring some new sculptures in, and then including a Song Dynasty Nanhai Guanyin, and which has been in the studio for last 30 years. And it's all in view, it's beautiful. And we regrouped the triad, the Tang Dynasty Buddhist triad together. So it's a new installation, and if you cannot make it this week, and I hope you can come back sooner. I'm sure now we are on the bright side, and hope to see you in person very soon.
Thank you very much, Tao. Thank you all of you for an excellent panel.